there, Banditos. Welcome to the latest episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits, where, as always, you know what we do. We talk to your favorite comic book creators of yesterday and today, and we do that by flinging open the doors of your local comic book shop, damn it, because that's how we like it. But before we get to that, let's introduce ourselves, shall we? I'm Joe Marcello.
I'm Warren Phillips.
I'm Mike Farah.
And today we're bringing you a pretty interesting interview. Someone who is, dare I say, not our typical guest. Someone who is an advertising guru, who's helped shape our childhood and just been very instrumental behind the scenes of a lot of the TV and movies that we've seen over the years. We're talking about Craig Miller. Just, hearing about his career before I actually listened to the interview with Mike and Oren, that is, I was just flabbergasted. He's worked on so many great properties. One of my favorites, The Real Ghostbusters, and needless to say, so many great others.
Yeah, those great others include Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, Superman 2. He was telling us being on set, a lot of behind the scenes things that was happening. It was his job to promote Star Wars when there was no internet. He just had to do, word of mouth, advertising, try to get the word out about Star Wars any way that he could. And I think he did a pretty good job about it. I think people still talk about that film today.
Star Wars?
I seem to remember something about Star Wars.
Yeah.
So he did his job well. And just like Oren said, it's so strange to think about before the internet, before sort of these mass communications and a little movie called Star Wars that you had no idea what it was, trying to explain the concepts of it before it came out. I mean, that had to be just a crazy experience. And then to go on to, all this animation. He worked on a lot of the kids' properties, Real Ghostbusters, like Joe said, but also Smurfs, Curious George. So some of the real sort of seminal kid stuff. So let's get to it. This is Craig Miller.
And we are so thrilled today to have Mr. Craig Miller joining us. Mr. Miller, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for inviting me.
So I just want to know, you've worked on so many things. Growing up, were you more drawn towards sci-fi or animation? What was it that piqued your interest in movies in Hollywood?
Well, I was always, I grew up as a fan of science fiction, a fan of comics, a fan of animation. I was just, a really nerdy kid, and I was into all that stuff. I hung out with people who I never back when I was young, it was before home video, but there were people who collected 16 millimeter prints. I'm sorry, there's a cat here. I collected, or I didn't, but friends collected 16 millimeter prints of things, and we go to people's houses every few weeks to see they'd gotten a print of, some Disney movie or some Warner's movies. A lot of them were people who worked in animation or otherwise in the movies. But I was, just a fan of movies. I didn't really have, other than living in LA, I didn't have any connection to Hollywood and filmmaking. I just sort of was a fan of it and kind of stumbled into working in the industry.
And just because we do comic books, we got to ask you, what were some of your favorite comic books growing up?
Oh boy, I read all kinds of stuff. I read, funny stuff like Archie and Veronica and Richie Rich, but I read, DC's, the Superman's, Batman's, Legion of Superheroes, and Marvel's. I was the right age for the early issues of Spider-Man and Fantastic Four and eventually X-Men. It's hard to think of eventually X-Men, and now it seems like they all sprung up all together. But I mean, I read everything. I was the founder of the LA Comic Book Club. I'm sure there were other LA comic book clubs, but we had one in Palms Park, which is a park in West LA, and a lot of people who have been involved with fandom and the comics and animation industry went through that club. Probably the best known one is Mark Evanier.
Mhm.
Mark joined the club. I was 12, he was 14, you know, so we've known each other a long time.
I because you've worked so in promotions and stuff like that, and you were as you said, the right age for when Spider-Man was coming out. For Marvel to have someone like Stan Lee getting out there in front of, large groups of people, comic fans and non-comic fans, for you as a young person, what was his presence, I guess, in the media? How influential was it on you to
Well,
gear towards Marvel?
I'm old enough. Comic conventions didn't start until, like the Phil Suling cons in New York, which I never attended because they were in New York and I was in LA. But those were what, the late 60s,
I think so.
maybe?
Yeah.
And then San Diego started in 1970. My first one was 74, down in San Diego. But so Stan was a presence in the comics. We didn't start seeing him as a, presence outside of, the Stan soapbox and stuff like that in the comics until later. So it wasn't like when I was 10, I was seeing him at a convention. That stuff, yeah, it's hard to think of now, but that stuff all came later. It's like I talk to people today, who, you look out today and every other movie is either science fiction or superheroes. Back in the 70s, when we were first doing Star Wars, science fiction was a rare thing, especially at an A level kind of thing. Most people thought of science fiction movies as terrible, as dopey, as being for kids, and most studios weren't releasing science fiction.
Hmm.
When Superman came out in 1978, that was like a serious superhero movie. That was bizarre. Even though it was released by Warner Brothers, it was really more a British production done by the Salkins, not really the studio thinking we're in the superhero business. So it was a whole different universe in terms of fans and fandom. We were really considered nerds and weird and geeks by people who love science fiction and comic books.
Mhm.
So, so it was just a completely different world back then. And, I'm really glad we're not considered, well, we're still considered weird and nerds and geeks, but we are in the majority now.
Yeah. It's a
More
badge of
acceptable.
honor.
Yeah.
So Oren alluded to the fact that you were working in kind of a publicity capacity, in the 70s and 80s, and working on a lot of movies that we remember very fondly, and some of our favorites, including Star Wars, Superman 2, Dark Crystal, Muppets Take Manhattan, things of that nature.
Right.
Could you tell us just a little bit more about what the job entailed? Like, what were you doing for these films?
Well, it varied. I was hired at first as a consultant and then on staff by Lucasfilm in 1976. I was fresh out of college. In fact, when I started, I was still in college because, again, was not a science fiction friendly world. Charlie Lippincott, who was the head of his title was Vice President of Star Wars Corporation, which was the marketing, licensing, merchandising arm of Lucasfilm. And basically anything that wasn't actually making the movie, Charlie was in charge of. And he was an established, movie publicity guy, executive, and he'd been hired to do this for Star Wars. And he realized that at the time, remember, no internet, science fiction is weird. the way you marketed movies in the main, besides just, general things, you tried to get your stars on like the Tonight Show or some other talk show. The Tonight Show was the main one you really wanted, but there were others you would try to get people booked on. And you'd get reviews and you'd try to get articles in magazines, but mostly about the actors, because everyone loves hearing about actors. No one in Star Wars was going to get booked on the Tonight Show. Mark, Carrie, Harrison, they're wonderful, but they were not names at that time. They were completely unknown. And they were in a science fiction movie, which is not something anyone cared about. Alec Guinness, Peter Cushing were much bigger names, but they're much bigger names in England. In the United States at that time, they were thought of as character actors and mostly known for like their horror movies. Again, you weren't going to get them booked onto the Tonight Show. So Charlie knew about fandom. He was not part of fandom, but he was aware of it. And that's where I came in. I was a fan. I grew up in fandom. I met Charlie and I was giving him advice and assistance with where to go to conventions to get the word out a year in advance of Star Wars coming out about this movie that was actually going to be good, wasn't going to be stupid, wasn't going to be bad, and have it, to build up buzz, to build up what the industry used to call want to see, the want to see factor. And there are whole, there's just like everywhere, there's demographics and stuff. Unaided want to see, aided want to see, all this kind of stuff for figuring out how much reach you've gotten, how much penetration to getting into people's consciousness. And that's basically what we were doing. Then after the movie came out, I was brought in full time on staff to continue doing stuff with fans and fandom. And also, at first, suddenly Star Wars was getting a lot of fan mail, tons and tons of fan mail. And not just the movie was getting it, George was getting it, the actors were getting it. And so I set up a fan mail system for the company. And I kept going to conventions and doing things and working with places like magazines like Starlog and Cinefantastique and Cinefex and all of those genre specialty magazines. And then doing more and more publicity, but with an eye towards what came to be called special publicity and niche marketing, but basically going to the people particularly interested in the subject. A lot of studios, even some today, but especially back then, was you promoted the movie to everybody and you didn't worry about the specialty audience because they would just show up.
Mhm.
And what we were doing was going to the specialty audience, the science fiction and comic book fans, and saying, hey, there's this good movie, really good, really. And after Star Wars came out, almost every studio really realigned their thinking as to ways to market. Because, movie making is magic. William Goldman once said, nobody knows anything when it comes to making movies. And it's true. It's all, you don't know for sure what'll work. It's all magic. And if it worked for somebody, you try it. And so suddenly everyone started going to science fiction and comic book conventions. Now even non-genre magazines movies and TV shows want to go and do something at Comic-Con or Dragon Con or New York Comic Con, but originally it was San Diego was the king.
Yeah, that's super interesting because it's hard for, I think, people, and we're of the age that we remember pre-internet, but you know, for a lot of kids, they're like, well, how the heck could you possibly market or get the word out about a film that nobody understands or knows any of the actors, and how do you make that successful?
Well,
So
that was the trick.
yeah,
And,
yeah,
you know,
a lot of out of the box thinking, it sounds like.
yeah, I mean, it was exactly that. Today, the internet makes it both easier and harder.
Mhm.
But you can reach out to the people you know are, and I hate to sound, you know, make this sound crass, but who are your market?
Mhm.
You are, you know, because it still comes down to it's a business and it's a commodity that you are selling. You're selling tickets. These days, you're selling merchandise. Back when Star Wars was made, you know, we all know the story. George said he wanted the merchandising rights, or actually, he wanted a bigger share of the merchandising rights. Fox, at the beginning, um, still had the merchandising rights, and all the contracts were written by Fox. But George got a much bigger share than anyone had before. And we at Lucasfilm controlled what licenses were sold and what products got approved. And Fox did that thinking, yeah, give it to him. That's cheap. Who cares about that? After Star Wars came out, they never made that deal with anyone else ever again, because suddenly licensing became extremely valuable. Licensing goes back a long way. I mean, there was merchandising, you know, I talk about this in my book in a chapter, but there were merchandising based on Dickens novels. You know, most of it not licensed. Dickens didn't get any money, so it was all bootleg, or most of it was. But I mean, but they were still doing tie-ins to things like the Old Curiosity Shop and Oliver Twist, you know. And Disney got rich in the 20s and 30s with Mickey Mouse licensing. So it's been around. It's just except for Disney, licensing was a very small thing, and so the studios didn't care that much about it. But I think I've gotten off the topic of your question. But it's really
Oh,
thinking out, like you said, thinking outside the box, coming up with ways to reach out to your potential audience. And I've done panels at places like Comic-Con in San Diego on, you know, marketing your project, publicizing your project. And even though I am definitely not a social media expert, I am on it, but you know, I'm not. The principles of publicity and marketing are the same. It's the tools you use that are different. It's just like, you know, artists. Now you have digital drawings you can do. So you're not using a pencil, but you're still doing art and you're still doing things. How you use the tools changes, but it's the concepts behind it. And, you know, you just have to look for ways. And that's what we did, look for ways to market it. And that's what I did for other studios after I left Lucasfilm. Warner's Jim Henson with Dark Crystal and the Muppets Take Manhattan. Warner's with Superman 2 and Excalibur and um, Altered States, Outland. Just you know, Disney, and I did movie marketing for about 10 years as this kind of special publicity, where we focused on not the getting a review in the local newspaper or Time magazine or today, you know, which websites and which podcasters, but the more specialized, the stuff where you were looking like on Excalibur for Warner Brothers. I went to Bride magazine. Bride magazine magazines, of course, today are much, much smaller. No one's buying newsstand magazines, but back in the 80s, they were huge. You know, Time magazine, Omni used to do like 1 million copies an issue. But anyway, I went to Bride magazine, which was the largest of the many different magazines aimed at the bridal industry, and in this case, aimed at the public. It was mostly articles about weddings and wedding gowns and, just stuff you could do. And I got them to run a pictorial on the wedding of Arthur and Guinevere from Excalibur, because all of the main marketing that Warner's was doing on Excalibur was basically targeted at men, college age, it's an action movie, that kind of thing. So that was where all of their focus went. I broadened our focus by targeting a publication that went, most guys were not reading Bride magazine. It was, probably 90% or more female readers, except for people in the actual bridal industry. So by doing this pictorial, we told women, hey, there's, certainly a lot of women like action adventure. But for the women who are not going, I want to see the next action adventure movie, saying there's this romance and a beautiful wedding and stuff, broaden the targeting. And we would do stuff like that, just to broaden it, to let people who might not otherwise know about it or might not innately say, oh, that sounds like a movie I want to see, know that there's something in it for them. And so, that's the kind of specialty marketing I did, but with a main focus on genre movies, science fiction, fantasy, horror.
So follow up on in this realm, which is that you've done this kind of work for a few sequels. So Empire Strikes Back, Superman 2, Muppets Take Manhattan, although that's probably less serialized. But yeah. Does that, it seems on the face of it that would make your job easier, but are there specific challenges that come with doing sequels?
Sure. So, there's no question it was easier to get people to go see Empire Strikes Back than Star Wars, but the thing is, you still have to convince them to go. And there are a lot of other things they could go to. So the fact that they might have liked the earlier movie makes it easier, but you still got to convince them it's going to be good. And a lot of sequels we know are not good. And an awful lot of sequels over the years were, here's the same movie with a slight change to the story. The second Hunger Games movie was essentially the same as the first Hunger Games movie.
Right.
If you liked the Hunger Games, they were both good, and I actually liked the Hunger Games, so that, I enjoyed them, but it was the same story. Oh, look, what's going to we're going to do another Hunger Games, but it's going to be bigger. Yeah, but it was still the Hunger Games. We made you come and we made you train, and now we made you not get killed. So it was the same story. And that happens to a lot of novelists writing sequels, because they hadn't, these days, everyone seems to go in writing a trilogy. So they're planning to make more than one story. But it used to be, oh, I wasn't planning to do another one, so I end up telling the same story again in the second book. So, but that was, so you had to convince people. You still had to convince them. And certainly with Empire, we went to it saying, we can't just sit back and say, hey, it's another Star Wars, come and see it. We wanted to make sure we were selling it. We were really convincing people it isn't going to be the same story, and it's going to be really good again. And that's why we did things when we the very first photo we released from The Empire Strikes Back was a photo of Luke on the Tauntaun. And we did that because, you know, sort of subliminally, it's saying, okay, Luke, this character, and probably other characters you liked are back. It's got this weird alien creature you've never seen before. We're not just doing the same creatures. And he's on a snow planet, which means it's a completely different environment than you've seen before. So that was picked specifically because it says it's the same but different. So thought goes into, or should, and in our case, did go into making choices like that. It wasn't just, here's Luke with a lightsaber, you know, on an Imperial, all the Imperial buildings all have the same weird architecture. So, you know, so here's Luke back on the Death Star. It doesn't say there'll be something even new.
Mhm.
So sequels have their own pluses and minuses. It's easier because you don't have to tell people what it is, but you want them to know it's not just that, it's more. Yeah.
I have to ask because you're just like us. You're a comic guy. You're a sci-fi fan. Being on the set, being part of Star Wars at the time, like I saw for your book, you were Underoos commercials for Star Wars. All these wonderful moments at the time. Did you take it all in like this is awesome, or was it this was the job at the time?
Oh my God,
and...
of course. You know, I do because of my book,
Mhm.
I do go to a lot of conventions when they invite me to come as a guest.
Mhm.
And I do a slideshow, a PowerPoint show. Back when we were doing Star Wars, it was actually slides, you know, 35 millimeter pieces of film and a little cardboard sleeve that we project on a screen. Now they're PowerPoint slides, but I do a slideshow that starts out with a photo and it just says a kid in a candy store. You know, because I was a huge science fiction fan. I was a movie fan, and here I was. I was never on the set for Star Wars. I was just a consultant when it was shooting, and I came in the summer of '76. It was towards the end of shooting, but I spent a lot of time on the set of Empire Strikes Back,
Mhm.
and you know that was just amazing. You know, I'm there doing work. You know, it's a job, and as cool as working on Star Wars is, it's still a job. You still gotta do the work. But it was amazing. I mean, I have not surprising. I have a copy of my book right here,
There you go.
and on the cover is the photo of me in front of the Millennium Falcon, and it's like, oh my God. You know, it's the full size Millennium Falcon in the ice cave, and
Mhm.
yeah, no, it was amazing. You know, I'd been on a movie set before when I was 16. I snuck onto the set of Conquest of the Planet of the Apes at 20th Century Fox and spent a night there, and then met the executive producer while I was there, and he invited me onto the location the next day, which was in Century City, and the next night, actually. And so I'd been on movie sets, but which was really cool. But that's not the same as actually like, and I'm here and I'm working on it. And, you know, it was, you know, it was just amazing. Just amazing. It's,
And
you
that,
know, what you always wanted, and now you're doing it.
I was gonna say. Just talking a little bit about as we were comics and films, you know, with Star Wars, with Superman, I'd say with the Michael Keaton Batman, a lot of these movies and the comics had a bit of a synergy. Fans who might not have known about the comics after seeing the movie would want to run out, pick up the Superman issues, they want to run out Batman issues, find the Star Wars comic issues. We're living right now in a golden age of comic book films and all these things, but that's not translating anymore. People aren't going looking for the old books. They're not even buying a lot of the new books. Can that bridge be built again, do you think? Or do you think that time is gone?
It's, it's hard. For probably 20 years now, the comic business is the development business for movies and television. The comics industry, to my understanding, I have a lot of friends who are comic book pros, some of them long time, some of them young, new guys working, some of them at Marvel and DC, some in indies. But for the most part, the money is in selling the rights to Hollywood to make the movie, getting the, I have longtime comics friends who made more because a character they created was in one of the 1980s Batman movies, or, because DC, with its creators, shares a piece of the revenue they get. And they've made, no one has said, well, now I have $10 million. It isn't that kind of money. Mm-hmm. But I mean, they've had big money payouts from this character was a main character in one of the Batman movies, or was a secondary character in one of the Batman movies. I don't want to give examples because it's not my place to say how much anyone made on anything.
Right.
But people, and Marvel is not as directly generous in that way, from my understanding. It's more DC says, you created this character, we made this much, you get that much. And Marvel is more, oh yeah, this has nothing to do with that character you created and how much we made. Yep. And we're not telling you how it's reflected in the amount of money, but here's some money because we like you.
Right.
So they are getting some amount of money, just some are more accounting.
Fuzzy accounting.
Into it. But I mean, the thing is, there's money being made by the companies from the revenue from the books, but the books aren't making enough money to keep them in business. Disney went into, in the, I guess, early 2000s, Disney took over the publishing of Disney comics, doing it in-house, and soon discovered that it was too expensive for them to do it themselves because of the overhead they needed to make off of the comics. So they went back to licensing the comics to other publishers. It's a sad state. Even, when I was a kid, comics were 10 cents, 12 cents, 15 cents. Now comics are $3, $5 a copy. And they're still not making enough money for the industry. But comics in the 60s were selling hundreds of thousands. I think it was Marvel had a thing that if a title went under 200,000, I think, if it went under 200,000, it stopped publishing.
Mm-hmm.
It's nothing to do with selling 200,000 today. Everyone dreams of selling that kind of number.
Yeah. I'm just curious, as a fan, because you got to work on Superman 2, which a lot of folks believe
excuse me,
kind of the blueprint for, superhero movies. Your thoughts on the movie and memories of working on it?
Well, Superman, I didn't work on Superman, but Superman and Superman 2 were great. I mean, yeah, I enjoyed the live action, the Adam West Batman movie, but it was, 60s camp Batman. It was silly. It had some of the stuff we all loved from the comics, but it was campy and comedy. Superman was a serious, somewhat lighthearted. I mean, it wasn't dark. It wasn't, the Tim Burton Batman movies or the uh, Nolan Batman
Mhm.
movies, but it was serious and dramatic and real. And like all the comic book fans, I think we all really loved those movies. They weren't perfect. I could have done without Otis. That was a character I thought, didn't match the rest. In fact, the whole Luther, Otis, Miss Teschmacher
Mhm.
kind of thing was like, we've got to have comedy in here.
Right.
Um, so for me, while I enjoyed it, that part kind of undercut the rest of the movie. But I think, you know, going with that made comics a serious thing again for movies. They were really enjoyable, and getting to work on Superman 2 was great. Um, I got, part of my job with Warner's is I would go back and meet with Saul Harrison, who was the publisher of DC Comics. And basically, I was just telling Saul what DC was doing with Superman 2 and how we were marketing it and how he could tie, you know, not content wise, we weren't doing that, but, just how they could tie into the marketing of it and stuff like that. And then I just had this conversation with Marv Wolfman over 4th of July. Um, I'd go back to New York, I'd meet with Saul, and then I'd spend the rest of the day hanging around the DC offices and hanging out with Marv and Len and Dave Cockrum and whatever comics guys who were friends of mine who happened to be in the office that day. So it was always a great trip for me, to
Wow.
go and do that. And then on the same trips, I would meet with uh, the Starlog editors and all the appropriate, magazine editors who I was dealing with, and set up articles they could do, and interviews that they wanted to have about the movies, things like that. So, that's what those trips were. But for me, as a comics fan, and because today you can still get to meet and know a lot of comics pros, but back then it was, you had to be, you met them at conventions, but everyone was open and friendly. We all hung out. Comic cons in the 70s and early 80s, especially in the 70s, it was all at the Comic Con in San Diego today is 135,000 people. In the 70s, it was like 5,000 people. And at first, they were all at the El Cortez Hotel, and they would do, and everyone would hang out around the pool, which was next to a bar. And so we were all hanging out there in the afternoon and evening, and everyone, just, you became friends with everybody. So it was just, now there are just so many people, it's harder to get to spend time with people like that. But I find comics pros are usually pretty open. Science fiction novelists, short story writers too, if you go to those conventions, are very open and friendly for the most part. So, it's Hollywood's a lot harder. They've got a lot more people going in at them trying to get to know them.
I wanted to move into your second career, as it were, which is as a writer for animation. And the first question being, how did you make that transition from the publicity world into the writing and actual production world?
The short answer is, like so much of life, it's knowing somebody. After about 10 years in movie marketing, I decided I wanted to do something that was more directly creative. and I always liked writing. And it seemed like an area I could make inroads in. I hadn't intended really to end up having so much of my writing career be animation rather than live action.
Mm.
It just sort of ended up that way. But I was friends with a guy named Joe Straczynski, better known professionally as J. Michael Straczynski, now best known with Babylon 5.
Mm.
But Joe was an animation writer back then. And we were friends, and he had just been hired to do the animated version of Ghostbusters called The Real Ghostbusters.
Mm.
I had not worked on the Ghostbusters movie, but I knew Joe, and I went to see him one day, and I asked him if, I could try writing for it, because I knew back in those days we used to get, very large orders for episodes. They were half-hour episodes, and the first season of Ghostbusters was done as a syndication package, which meant they ordered 65 of them all at once. Now, you don't deliver them all at once. You deliver them,
Mhm.
depending on your schedule, 1 or 2 a week. But it still takes a lot of people coming up with a lot of stories. So on an order like that, today you go to the people you've worked with before, and since our first orders are typically more like 13 episodes, 12 or 13 episodes, mostly you end up doing it yourself and with a couple of people that you've worked with recently.
Mm.
Back then, 65 episodes, the people from as experience, you're going to use up quickly, and you need more people. So on those kinds of large orders, it was easier for new writers to get in. But because I knew Joe, he was willing to take a chance. And that doesn't mean he said, here's money, come back with a script. He let me come back with pitches. He gave me a show Bible. He let me come back with pitches. He let me write an outline for one he liked. He liked the outline. I wrote the script. I ended up writing 3 episodes of the first season of Real Ghostbusters, one of which became back when we did videotape and not, as home video, the first home video was called, it had a headline, The Real Ghostbusters, and it said, The Bird of Kildarby and Other Stories. And one of my episodes was The Bird of Kildarby. So that was the title episode on the first home video release of Real Ghostbusters. Anyway, I did 3 episodes that season, and then I got hired on another show at a different studio called The Bionic Six, which people who saw it at the time, there's a surprising to me large fan base for it, but it never got syndicated. So actually, it must have been syndicated because we did 65 episodes. But I mean, it went through that first round of syndication, never came out on home video, never continued in home video. You can find some of it streaming these days.
Mhm.
You can find everything streaming. But that show had originally been developed as a serious dramatic action adventure show. It came from Universal, who thought they owned the word bionic because of the Bionic Woman and the $6 Million Man. It wanted an animated bionic show. Well, the show was really dopey. The concept behind it was really dopey. And they wrote 6 episodes, something like that. And they realized that as a straight, serious action adventure show, this concept didn't work. So they reworked it and brought in new writers, and I was one of the newer writers, And we did the exact same show, but played it for comedy. And the reality is storytelling is storytelling. Even comedy stories, have a beginning, middle, and end, have a need, have all the same things. It's how you tell it. And so we told those the same story, not the same stories, but stories about those same characters and the same bad guys with the same superpowers, but we just told them as comedy. But anyway, I wrote 10 of the 65 episodes of Bionic 6. And then I went on to other shows and just kept going in animation and developed some of my own shows, both here. And I've done a lot of stuff for channels and companies overseas. I've done shows in China, France, Italy, Israel, Dubai, so all over the place. And of course, here in the US. And so that kept me busy for a long time. And I still write animation. Then I've written Star Wars Memories. I'm at work on a biography of Gary Kurtz as my next book, because I think not enough has been written about Gary, not just about Star Wars, but Star Wars and Empire will certainly be a big part of it. But Gary started in, doing, he worked for Roger Corman on movies. He was a cameraman, he was a sound guy, he did all kinds of production stuff. He was, interestingly and amazingly, he was in Vietnam in the Marines. He was a conscientious objector. He would not carry a weapon. His lieutenant required him to carry a gun, so he had an unloaded pistol that he wore in a holster, but he was a cameraman and he went out to the front lines with squads of soldiers and shot film for the military in combat in Vietnam, which I just think is a pretty amazing thing. But I mean, he's had a long career in Hollywood on a lot of different kinds of movies, and was, really a filmmaker when it meant making the film, not just being a producer who made deals. And I worked with Gary on a number of different movies, starting with Star Wars and through the rest of his career till he passed away. And so I'm working on that with the approval and support of his family. And
could I drill into a couple of your other animated projects, if you don't mind? So one is Smurfs, which I'm not sure how much you worked on that, but I loved it as a kid, and I'm wondering whether there were, you guys had any kind of parameters from that you had to work within from the original Belgian creators or anything like that.
Well, I came to Smurfs towards the end.
Okay.
It had been on for years, like 10 years, I think. And I worked on its last 2 seasons. The last season where it was still the Smurfs as you knew it growing up.
Right.
And then in order to try to get a final season or more seasons out of it, they did this weird thing where they developed it where a small number of Smurfs were traveling through time and having adventures.
Okay.
And so I wrote in the last season of Real Smurf, I call Real Smurfs, and then in the one season of Time Traveling Smurfs. And it was really interesting. I mean, one of the problems was there had already been 300 episodes of the Smurfs. So coming up with stories they hadn't done was tough.
Yeah.
The time traveling ones were easier because they really hadn't gone back to meet, Julius Caesar before, stuff like that. But It was also the most violent show I ever worked on.
Oh.
Really?
So in kids television, there's all this, you can't do real violence, you can't do what's called imitatable behavior, something a kid might try. So you always avoided that kind of stuff. So in the first Smurf episode I wrote, the Smurfs needed Gargamel's help for something. So they're in the woods, and Gargamel is taking a nap. He's lying on the ground with his head on one end of a hollow log, snoring away. And in order to wake him up, excuse me, I'm sorry. I've got a tickle in my throat. I wrote this trepidatiously. I put into the outline that one of the Smurfs throws a rock at the far end of the log from where Gargamel is. And it hits the log and it starts the log vibrating. And the vibrations get bigger and bigger as it goes down the log until they're so big they throw Gargamel up in the air and wake him up. And I was trepidatious because it's like, are they going to let me even throw a rock without, you know? And the note I got back was, why don't you just have him hit him in the head with the rock? It's like, really? And so that's what we did. They throw the rock and it hits him in the head, bonk, and he wakes up. It's like, I could not do that in a superhero show. We could not do anything like that. But the Smurfs were the Smurfs, and it was okay. So, more violent than, any of the action adventure shows. But Smurfs were interesting. I had it in my deal. I wanted more money than their average rate. And they said, well, we'll give you this deal. You write 3 at the average rate, and after that, you'll give you the rate you want. And I said, great. And I wrote 3 episodes, and then I was told I wasn't Smurfy enough, and they did not pay me to write more episodes at the higher rate. Well, unlike the Bionic 6, where I wrote, I think I'd written 3 or 4 episodes, and they called me in. They wanted to give me a 5-episode contract. And I said, great. And I went in and I read the contract, and it required me to be available to write up to 5 episodes more for the same rate, but did not require them to pay me any more money or to absolutely give me 5. Just I would be available for 5. And I said, this just saves you having to issue a contract for every episode I write. This is just saving you paperwork. No, you want me to do that, there's got to be a guarantee, and I want more money. And they were like, well, okay. And I ended up getting, not a big raise, but I got like $500 more an episode. And I ended up writing 10 episodes, either 6 or 7 more episodes than I'd written when I'd gone in. So, but it guaranteed me a minimum of 5 more. So it's like, you want the contracts where they guarantee you more and actually pay you more, as opposed to using it as a carrot to keep you there. Anyway, that's why I only ended up doing 3.
Well, one thing that you worked on with somebody who you mentioned before, Marv Wolfman, was Pocket Dragon Adventures.
Yeah.
You've also worked on Curious George. My question for you is, you've worked on animation that's kind of had a range of different ages for children, and also educational and, more fun shows. How do you sort of mentally gear the voice and what you want to say to each different audience?
It helps to be schizophrenic. No, I mean, a lot of writers, live action and animation, target one area, and they do comedy, they do young comedy, they do educational, they do action adventures. That's where they shine. That's what they do. I've always just enjoyed lots of different things. Um, I never claim that I'm the best writer in the world, but I'm a good writer. I've been doing this for doing animation for close to 40 years now. So I guess I'm okay at it. And I just, it's thinking about who is my audience and enjoy, and it's also, I enjoy action adventure. I enjoy superheroes. I enjoy silly comedy. And being able to think that way. When we were doing Pocket Dragon Adventures, which is a show Marv and I co-created and co-produced, we did 104 11-minute episodes of that. Marv and I each wrote like 3 episodes together, and then we wrote like 25 each separately, and then hired other writers for the rest. But I had someone who, very talented action adventure writer who had never written comedy, and I worked with her because I wanted her to work on the show, and she didn't think she could write comedy. It's like, yeah, you can. We're still telling the same stories. It's, you pull out the sword and the blade breaks off. It has funny moments in it, but you're still telling the same story. So, and not ever talking down to anybody. The big problem I found with a lot of people in animation, they think kids, especially younger kids, if you're doing preschool or 5 to 8-year-old shows, they think they're stupid. Kids aren't stupid. Kids aren't educated. They don't have a very big world view. I don't know if either of you guys have a kid. But yeah, I don't actually, but one of my degrees is in child development. But kids haven't been exposed to a lot of things, so their pool of knowledge is narrow and somewhat shallow, but they're not stupid. And you need to treat them that way. Part of what we're doing with animation or shows for kids is broadening and deepening that pool. We're putting information in it. I'm a big believer in learning through osmosis. You expose kids to information, whether it's an educational show or not. If you put information in, but in a fun way, they will pick it up. They may not learn every detail, of a lesson plan, but they'll pick up information. I learned about parts of the world by reading books, by reading comic books set in other parts of the world. So and I picked them up by osmosis. They weren't lessons. As a kid, I wasn't going to sit and listen to or watch a TV show where someone says, this is what we're teaching you now, and this is how you do it. And there's,
Right.
But if you mention things in it, I'll pick it up. Which is why you want the information in a kid show, whether it's supposedly educational or not, to be accurate. But you treat kids as intelligent. And if there's something you think they may not know, you put it in there visually. You don't just refer to it as if they'll understand some allusion to something. But that's how you learn. That's how you get information. So, so writing for younger kids is just writing simpler. You don't have deep, complex connections, but you can still have human emotion. You just do it on a Wait, there was a show based on the Clifford the Big Red Dog books.
Mm-hmm.
And I know a writer went in and pitched an episode to someone, and that was done as I guess a preschool show. And the story they pitched was that there was this thing, and it doesn't matter what the thing is, but some MacGuffin that goes missing. And so one of the kids thinks it's been stolen. And there's a whole thing around finding it, and it wasn't stolen, and being sorry for jumping to conclusions and helping each other. That was the story they were pitching.
Mhm.
And the showrunner turned it down, saying kids don't have a sense of ownership. Now, kids may not have a sense of you own something, but my God, kids understand mine. At a very early age. 3-year-olds know mine. The kids have a sense of ownership. So it's understanding what kids are really not like, and not thinking kids are dumb or kids don't understand. One of the problems a lot of parents have with kids, they don't think kids will understand what's going on and then kids take some lesson or some message out of something the parent did,
Mhm.
Not meaning to suggest the kid was bad or something was bad or something was scary, but the kid picks up that lesson because kids are learning all the time. They're picking stuff up when you have no idea they're picking stuff up. Anyway, I take pride in the fact that I've been successful at writing comedy, at writing action adventure, young and old and educational. It's something I've tried to do and something I've been able to do fairly well.
Mhm.
So some of my Curious George episodes have been turned into Curious George books, which is really
Nice.
cool.
Yeah.
Because I grew up with Curious George,
Mm-hmm.
reading the books. So now having Curious George books that say based on a script by Craig Miller is really cool.
Yeah. I mean, that can be as mind-blowing as the Star Wars stuff to
Yeah.
some people. I mean, certainly my daughter loved the new Curious George when she was younger, and we bought the books too. So
Yeah.
that's fantastic. You talked about just looking forward now for a second as we start to wrap up. You talked about your book out, which is Star Wars Memories. You're working on a biography of Gary Kurtz. Anything else that we can look forward to from Mr. Craig Miller?
Well, there are a couple of other books in the pipeline I'm working on. None of them are going to come out immediately. The Gary Kurtz biography. I'm working on a follow-up to the Star Wars book. Instead of Star Wars Memories, it's going to be more movie memories about the movies I worked on after leaving Lucasfilm, some of which we talked about.
Yeah.
And I'm working on an animation writing book, a book on how to write animation. I taught animation writing at the Art Institute of California for 5 years, I think, as a part-time instructor, and I really enjoyed doing that. And so I think writing that book will be fun, and I get lots of questions about it. So
Excellent. We'll look forward to that.
And of course, future animation projects, as people come to me and say, we'd like you to develop this, or we'd like you to write episodes for us, and because I'm not desperate to do it. I don't need it to pay my mortgage, but I do enjoy doing it, and I do it as much as I can.
Great. Well, we look forward to anything that's on the horizon that has your name on it.
Well, thank you.
Where can fans follow you if you have social media or website presence?
The easiest way to find me is I'm on Facebook as Craig Miller, and there's the banner photo is the photo of me in front of the Millennium Falcon, because there are a lot of people named Craig Miller. And there's also a Star Wars Memories page, which isn't as active as it should be, but you can reach me through that. I am on Twitter, but not very often. Twitter and Instagram, I have accounts more to read other people's stuff than to post anything, because it's hard for me, as you've seen with my answers, it's hard for me to say anything in in 235 characters or whatever I guess it's 500 and some characters now on Twitter, but short answers are not my thing.
And we're back. I'm George Lucas, and I approve this interview with Craig Miller.
Really? Was that him?
That was him. That was George Lucas. Thank you,
didn't know we
George.
had him
Thank
today.
you. Thank you.
Nice of him to stop by.
Yep. And he was doing laundry in my basement. No, but seriously, this is a great interview. I really find Craig's career absolutely interesting. I've said it before, but I love guys who kind of cover different genres, who do different things. And again, so instrumental in shaping our childhood and what we've seen over the years. Just amazing, and just a great interview altogether.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, he's just one of the coolest guys, and we say this a lot, but definitely we need to have him back, because I think we just hit the tip of the iceberg with all the stories he has, all the people he's spoken to. He was just sort of name dropping comic book royalty, and we're just saying like, oh my goodness, like what a charmed life, but a life that he got by working very hard, and you can definitely tell he's passionate about what he does.
Yeah, some of these guys, their career, you can't imagine what it was like. And the stories Craig had to tell were just almost unimaginable, like Oren said. So it was a pleasure to have him on. I'm sure he has a bunch more stories if we have him on again. So we will try to do that. Guys, before we go, I wanted to clue you in again, because the event is coming up on November 18th in East Rockaway, New York. It's called Huracan. And it's that comics art convention that benefits Bethany Church, which is the place that kind of held things together when Superstorm Stanley hit that area really hard. So friends of our show, like Keith Williams and Franco, will be there. So definitely check it out. November 18th at the Bethany Church itself, 100 Main Street in East Rockaway. This Saturday, November 18th, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Check it out. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for rating, reviewing, and subscribing. And we will see you next time.